United Lutheran Seminary presents the Seminary Explores podcast, conversations on faith, art, people, politics, theology, life, and more, with voices from around the corner and around the globe.
Welcome to the Seminary Explores. My name is Nelson Strobert, and today my guest is Dr. Nelson Rivera, who is professor of Theology and Ethics at United Lutheran Seminary. Welcome to the Seminary Explores, Nelson.
Thank you. It is my honor.
It's my honor to be able to have a conversation with you, and I'm going to just dig right into it and say many people have heard the term Liberation Theology or Liberation Theologies, plural. How would you define these terms?
A good question to start with. I like to quote Gustavo Gutiérrez, the Peruvian Roman Catholic theologian, rather an ecumenical theologian, as I like to call him. For Gutiérrez, Liberation Theology is basically having an option for the poor, which means putting the perspective, the context of the poor first in our theological reflection about faith, about the Christian life, about Christians' involvement in society. Gutiérrez, very early in his seminal work, A Theology of Liberation Perspective, defines both terms. On the one hand, liberation. He says that liberation begins with what he calls the social, political, and economic context of people's life. So, if theology, as he defines it, is a critical reflection upon the human experience, then that reflection ought to tackle first, the social, the political, and the economic realities of people's life, of society at large, but always beginning with the least among us, the people who have less, or the poor. Gutiérrez also calls the attention that in the New Testament, the noun for the poor is always used in the plural, never in the singular.
Really?
I checked that. It's true. It is true in the New Testament Greek. That means that the poor is a lot of people in different circumstances. So that may include people economically poor, politically powerless, people with diseases, people who are thought to be leader or be leader in society. So the poor is like an umbrella category, and theologians and any Christians, to be honest, ought to be able to identify who are the poor in their own context.
Okay.
Like fill in the blank. It may be women and children, the elderly, LGBTQ people who are thought to be less than others, economically poor, unemployed, etc. So again, for Gutiérrez, liberation begins in the social and political and economic aspects of people's life. But also liberation is humanistic in the sense that people need education, opportunities, access to culture, cultural means, things like art and music that enrich people's lives. So people need access, good access, everybody, to these aspects of a human life, of a good human life. Liberation is also spiritual, of course. And for Gutiérrez, this is basically gospel-oriented. It's about grace. It's about faith. It's about the following of Jesus Christ. It's about praising God, the worship of God, sharing the good news of the gospel. So people need to have access to be liberated so that they can have a full life in all these spheres of the human experience. Again, the social, political, economic, also cultural, humanistic, but also spiritual or gospel oriented.
Okay.
Another thing that Gutierrez says is that faith is always first. Theology is always like the second act.
Okay.
So there is experience of faith, people of faith. Theology comes later because theology will always be reflection upon faith, upon the experience of faith, but it's a critical reflection. So again, in his original work, Gutierrez tackles both liberation and theology, and also says, and he kept repeating that till the end of his life, that at one point he said, liberation theology is 90% having an option or a primary option or a preferential option for the poor among us. Not an exclusive option, but a primary one.
Oh, okay. Which says to me that liberation theology, I think very often people think of liberation theology as coming from the Southern Hemisphere, from South America. And but how you describe it and the way you describe it says that liberation theology is a theology that encompasses globally people around the world.
Yes, indeed. In terms of academic writing, we have, for example, again, Gutierrez's seminal book, A Liberation of Theology, published in 1971. Gutierrez had already published what has been called the long essay about towards a theology of liberation in 1968. There was already a dissertation by a Brazilian theologian, Rubén Alves, from 1967 that a lot of people believe is the first academic writing towards a theology of liberation, but is little known to this day. But soon enough, many other theologians and preachers were doing theologies of liberation in many places. And of course, in the American United States context, you have the Black theology of liberation.
Right.
And James Cone, actually, if I recall well, a Black theology of liberation was published already in 1970. So you could put there James Cone as a pioneer very early on as well.
Indeed.
But liberation theology is global. Nowadays, it goes by many names in many places, where it's Dalit theology in India or Mingyong theology in South Korea. In Latin America, there's also ecofeminist theologies that are forms of liberation theology among Latinas in the United States, mujerista theology. There's also womanist. And all of these are forms of liberation theology in one way or another.
Right, right. Now, could you share with us how and when did your interest in liberation theology begin?
Interestingly enough, the first book about liberation theology that I read was, and I mentioned him before, James Cone, A Black Theology of Liberation. I was a university student, and I found a Spanish translation published in Argentina. But there was a Catholic bookstore near my university. I studied at the University of Puerto Rico. And I found this book, Teología Negra de la Liberación. And I read it. And it had a tremendous impact on me. Next, I learned from friends of mine, especially someone who was doing studies at the Evangelical Seminary of Puerto Rico, that there was this theology of liberation coming out of Latin America. And this friend shared with me a basic bibliography that he got from one of his professors at the Evangelical Seminary. And of course, on that list, as you may guess, Gustavo Gutiérrez, Leonardo Bosch, Enrique Dussel, John Sobrino, those were the names on the list. So I started reading, especially Gutierrez. And since then, I have always had this interest in not just understanding, but also see the contributions that many other liberation theologians from many other places have contributed to the movement, the thinking. Today, as you know, there was Palestinian liberation theology. Before that, there was already a Jewish liberation theology and a Muslim liberation theology, and so on.
Okay. Yeah, I had no idea, of that perspective, that global perspective in liberation theology. You mentioned some names of these theologians, liberation theologians. Would it be possible for you to repeat some of those names and their contributions to liberation theology?
The one I have read the most and followed, and even taught a class at one point, is Gustavo Gutiérrez, the late Gustavo Gutiérrez. Actually, he died in the fall of 2024.
Oh.
And Gutiérrez left a good body of publications. I have them all. And at one point, I taught a class on the theology of Gustavo Gutiérrez. So he has been the one that I have engaged the most and by far.
Okay.
Actually, I had the privilege to listen to Gutiérrez. He came to Camden, outside of Philadelphia, Camden, New Jersey.
Okay.
Rutgers University. And he was brought by the Romero Center, Catholic Studies Center attached to the university there, or in relation to the university. And I had the opportunity to listen to Gutiérrez without notes, speaking in English, for a full hour.
Oh, my.
With an auditorium that was packed, a lot of them young people. That was really inspiring to me. Anyway, so the contributions of Gutiérrez are plenty, and a lot of other liberation theologians have been in dialogue with Gutiérrez ever since.
Okay.
Of course, as the movement grows and the perspective mature, at times, people like, for example, Brazilian ecofeminist theologian Ivone Guevara, she has written about Gutiérrez, acknowledging the many contributions that Gutiérrez made, but at the same time saying, but there's more to be said. And at times, adding some critical remarks, but always acknowledging how important he has been for the movement in Latin America, in the Spanish-speaking countries, also Brazil, Portuguese-speaking country, and beyond. So Gutiérrez, one of the main contributions, besides what we said before about the option for the poor being, as he liked to say, 90% of our theology of liberation is all about, among his contribution is, of course, on the contextual aspect of theology.
Right.
Not just liberation theology.
Okay.
Any theology worth its name should be truly contextual, respond to the questions of its day, of its time, of its geography. And of course, Gutierrez helped us to understand the meaning of contextual theology. That context is geography, is history, is culture, is religious history, is anthropological assumptions. I mean, who's there? Who are the people who live in that place? So context itself is a broad concept or term that needs to be defined. So he helped us to define context and what a contextual theology is all about.
Okay. Oh, thank you for that. And mentioning those two theologians that exemplify liberation theology. The other aspect of liberation theology that I find interesting is that so many of these theologians have come from the Roman Catholic tradition. And I wanted to know whether there were Protestant or Lutheran liberation theologians.
Yes, the one I mentioned before, Rubén Alves, Brazilian, he was Presbyterian. He's one of the pioneers, or was one of the pioneers himself. In the context of Brazil and Lutheranism in Brazil, and the School of Theology there in São Leopoldo in Brazil, people like Walter Altman.
Oh, yes.
He actually wrote a book translated into English as Luther and Liberation. There are 2 editions already of the book. And Altman embraced theology of liberation, but as a Lutheran theologian and a Luther scholar, he brought these movements into dialogue in a very fruitful way. So I would say Altman has been a major influence on me as a theologian who have read and embraced forms of liberation, as a Lutheran theologian who have embraced and follow forms of liberation theology. Victor Vestele, another Brazilian theologian who taught many years at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. He wrote also on aspects of liberation theology and Lutheran theology, of course. So his writings, after his untimely death, Vestele's writings on liberation and Lutheranism were put together in a volume, which I recommend to anyone. So those are the main names that come to mind. There are others. For example, Elsa Tamés from Costa Rica, who is a Methodist.
Oh, okay.
And taught New Testament in the seminary there in San Jose, Costa Rica. And of course, even among Lutheran scholars, Hispanic scholars in the United States, like Jose David Rodriguez, who taught many years also at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago, and others.
Okay. Well, thank you for that update, and some Altman I have on my bookshelf, but some of the others I have not read. So I'm stimulated to go and get those books. And now, as you describe liberation theology and its aspects and context, etc., what has been some of the criticism of liberation theology?
Yeah, I could say that, to start with, some of the criticism, I believe, were unjustified, misrepresentations or misunderstanding. On the other hand, we have to keep in mind that there are many liberation theologians, so they are not caught, as they say.
Okay.
They have their own questions. they respond to their own context. After all, liberation theologies are contextual theologies. They have to respond to their own circumstances and situations in life. But some of the criticism, as you may guess, has to do with too much emphasis on political liberation, economic liberation, too strong an emphasis on the here and now rather on the then and later, to put it that way.
Okay.
All depend, again, on whom are you reading. But again, with Gutierrez, you start with the basics. If you really care about people, if you really care about their liberation, about their well-being, about having a good life, you start with the basics, with the social and the political context and the economic context and jobs and respectful life.
Right.
Of course, and then of course education and culture and access to means and take it from there, right? Another critique has been that some of them were influenced by Marxism. And I actually was asked to write a dictionary entry. There is a dictionary of Luther and the Lutheran traditions that was published a few years ago. I think it was 2015 or 2016, if I recall well. And I was asked precisely to write the article on liberation theology and Marxism. So what it tells you, the topic was given to me. I would have actually wished that they had just said, write about liberation theology from a Lutheran perspective, but they said, no, it's liberation theology and Marxism. So I have to tackle this relationship and also give a Lutheran perspective, which I did, good or not so good. Well, you be the judge, but it's published in that dictionary.
Okay.
But to be honest, many of the liberation theologians from Latin America and beyond, they didn't use a lot of Marxism as people believed. Actually, the people who said that, they didn't read any of them, to be honest. Now, some did. There was a Mexican theologian, Jose Porfirio Miranda, who wrote a very important book, actually, a very foundational book, Marx and the Bible. And I'm sure people, just by that title, I'm pretty sure that very few people actually took the time to read it. Because of the prejudices, etc. And there were others who embraced some of Marx's ideas. Now, in my own research and in my own understanding, what I discovered is, as Gutierrez would say, Gutierrez says that the only contribution by Marx that he had use for was Marxism as a tool of social analysis. Now, they treat Marx primarily, those who did, not many, but those who did,
right? They
treated Marx primarily as a philosopher, not so much as an economist.
Okay.
Not that Marx didn't have, obviously, contributions to economic theory, but it was primarily to what Marx himself called political economy. So anyway, but for that dictionary article, I have to tackle this question about what from Marx, the philosopher, the thinker, some liberation theologians have taken and run with it. And I realized that there were like about 5 or 6 philosophical concepts, like, for example, uh, the importance of praxis, uh, the meaning of praxis. That is, it goes beyond just practice or action or production. Praxis is really a subject's activity, what a subject has to do to transform the material conditions of life. So, in a sense, praxis is like the bridge between subjective and objective aspects of the human experience.
Right.
Just to put it,
Right.
as a very short dictionary definition. So anyway, the Liberation Theologians really make use, beginning with Gutiérrez, of the concept of praxis, to the point of Gutiérrez saying, theology is praxis, meaning the praxis of faith.
Right.
How do we really act as Christians, as disciples of Christ in this world? And then there are other concepts that are very familiar to many people today without thinking that they came from Marx, like the concept of alienation, the concept of commodity,
right.
the illusion of objective value. For Marx, for example, paper money was the biggest of abstractions. And of course, he wrote a lot about that. And so there are these concepts, philosophical concepts, the communal formation of human identity that Marx actually wrote about, especially not just in the so-called manuscripts of 1844, the young Marx manuscript. Of course, they make use of that because it's what has been called by Erich Fromm and others Marx humanism.
Okay.
So yes, that has an influence, but to accuse them of just pure Marxist or even worse, communist, that was for political reasons.
Right. It's a misnomer, for sure.
It's a misnomer in many ways. Although, again, José Porfirio Miranda, he said that he actually found a form of communism in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2. And of course, he wanted to be very provocative about it. You know, like, read Acts chapter 2, what it says there.
Indeed. I can't believe our time is running out, but I would like to know whether you'd be able to help those in our listening audience who have been stimulated by your discussion on liberation theology, what books or areas that they might begin to study and gain more insight into liberation theology.
Yeah. On the one hand, there are these foundational texts that are still a pretty good introduction to liberation theology. One of them was written by brothers Leonardo and Clodovis Boff, B-O-F-F, both Brazilian priests and theologians, and they wrote a book translated into English as Introducing Liberation Theology. Leonardo and Clodovis Boff, Introducing Liberation Theology. The title in Portuguese should be translated more like How to Do Liberation Theology, How to Practice Liberation Theology. And then, of course, I think it's still a good reading, Gutierrez's seminal book, A Theology of Liberation Perspective. Now, my favorite Gutierrez book is The God of Life. Why? because he does a lot of biblical exegesis, you realize that the Bible really shows in many ways a God who cares for the people who suffer,
Yes.
those who are persecuted, those who are rejected, the least, the poor, the oppressed. In the history of Israel, through the prophets, references to God, as Gutierrez explains, the Goel, can be translated as the emancipator, the liberator, the one who takes care of the least, abounds in the Hebrew Bible and extends into the New Testament writings. So that book, The God of Life, I would strongly recommend it. Again, especially because Gutierrez brings the Bible, the testimony of the whole of the scriptures to bear upon this faith in a God, in a liberating God, in a God who deeply feels the pain and the suffering of the people, of the many people.
Okay. Wow.
Definitely. There is, for the history, there is a book published just a few years ago by Maria Wingemer, and is the history. It's a short history of liberation theology, especially in a Latin American perspective. But she also brings it to bear to that global perspective that we talk about. Maria Wingemer. It's more like a historical introduction, where it comes from and where are we today with it.
Right. Oh, great. Well, I thank you for those suggestions, and I want to thank you for this stimulating conversation and an introduction to liberation theology. My guest today has been Dr. Nelson Rivera, who is professor of Theology and Ethics at United Lutheran Seminary. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Rivera.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Indeed. For the Seminary Explorers, this is Nelson Strobert. Have a good day.
You have been listening to The Seminary Explorers, a production of United Lutheran Seminary with campuses in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We invite you to visit our website at unitedlutheranseminary.edu. All opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of United Lutheran Seminary or the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America.